but again, a hard act to follow. Well, I commend all of you for investing in your health, investing in learning more about how to be healthy, not only eating, but healthy lifestyles. I want to thank Pastor Phil for inviting me here to speak to you tonight. It's a privilege to be here, and I think this is a great opportunity. This symposium, this routine meeting that you have is a great opportunity for us to learn and grow healthy, and I'm glad to be a part of that. Many times we think of a healthy lifestyle as what we eat, like dinner tonight, drinking enough liquids during the day, healthy habits, and so forth. And many of us don't really think about social media, smartphones, and so forth affecting our health directly or affecting our mental health. But we're, as you know, engaged and involved with this process of using screens and social media, and it is influencing us. And tonight we're going to delve into a little bit about how it affects our brain, how it affects it directly. And I think it's important, for everyone here to understand that these important tools that we use do have a direct effect on our brain and how we think and what we do. My perspective in this comes from a number of different angles. I'm a neurosurgeon, a neuroscientist involved in research, also been a father of 3 kids, and I'm a user of social media and screens and smartphones. It's a part of medicine these days, and so with that perspective, I've really taken a look at how the social media is affecting us, particularly our young people. I think we all know that social media, screen time, and so forth has an effect on us. We hear about it in the papers, we read about it, and frequently hear people saying, "Well, I'm going to do a fast. I'm going to stay away from my phone, or I'm going to stay away from my Facebook account," and so forth. So I think we all know at an intuitive level that there can be some direct effect on us. One scientist stated that this sort of recent and sudden development of our immersion, if you will, into social media and screen time, digital media, and so forth, we've all become unwilling participants in a grand social and biological experiment. We really have. We just don't know what and how all of this are going to influence us and most importantly, influence our kids. So another scientist took a look at just something very simple, that people who are addicted to their smartphones and so forth develop anxiety if they're away from their cell phones for as short as 10 minutes. 10 minutes. How many people here use smartphones and have them with them tonight? So we're going to do a little experiment. Let's all turn to your phones to silent, and maybe put them away from you in a purse or a bag or someplace a little bit away from you. And what some of the research has shown is that after 10 minutes, for those people who are addicted to their cell phones, they will start to have all the signs of sort of stress, anxiety, sweaty palms, and if you measure their stress hormone, cortisol, their cortisol level actually goes up. So we'll do this little experiment tonight. Just put away your phones while we talk the next 10, 20 minutes, and we'll find out who the addicts are. Don't worry, there'll be no serum cortisol at the end of the evening. So why is this important? And I came across a number of different very interesting facts that I think show us why it is so important for us to sort of understand how cell phones and screen time and our involvement with social media will affect us. The average time for young people in front of their screens, according to the U.S. Department of Health, is 9 hours a day. 9 hours a day. And for many adults, it's similar. For those who work at a computer and then go home, adults, their screen time is enormous. 50% of young people surveyed felt that they were addicted to their cell phones and their smartphones. And I found this to be an interesting statistic. 6 billion people in the world have access to a portable device or a portable phone, but only 4.5 billion people have access to a working toilet. So I'm not sure how we apply that, but I just thought that was a very interesting statistic. 81% of adults have their phone within arm's reach at all times, night and day. And 1 in 5 young people, students, school, etc., admit to checking their phone at least every 5 minutes. Every 5 minutes. People are starting to have sort of some subtle side effects. There can be, you've heard of phantom pain. People can have phantom vibration. They don't even have their phone on them, but they think their phone is vibrating in their pocket. I think many people have experienced that. As I've spoken about that, people have raised their hand and said, that's me. In China, screen addiction is a clinical, medically defined problem. And they've established rehab centers for people with this sort of screen addiction. It mostly has to do with gaming. I understand gaming is very sort of big in China, so they have a larger problem than we have, but sometimes sort of looking into other countries, we can get an idea of what could or it might happen here. Those people who grow up or have grown up with smartphones, it has been shown through medical and scientific studies that their attention span is less than 5 minutes. That they admit, while being asked to focus and experiment on a task, that in less than 5 minutes, they will be drawn or tempted to move on to another task. So we have measurably less ability to concentrate, potentially as a consequence of our overindulgence with screen and screen time. And I think many of us have heard the question about what the radio frequency from phones will do to our brains or do to our bodies. Radio frequency in other venues and other situations is spoken about as a carcinogen. And so there's some people who feel, and you've probably heard these stories, that some of the radio frequencies emitted by our electronic devices that we live with and near may be a carcinogen. The World Health Organization, WHO, as far back as 2011, made the statement that cell phones may cause cancer. So I don't want you to sit there and think that Dr. Armstrong thinks that cell phones are going to cause cancer, but I do think that that sort of information lets us know that we don't have all the scientific data yet about what all of this will do to us. And we're going to talk about some of the things we do know this evening, but I think that's one of the take-home lessons is it isn't just a toy, it isn't just benign, it's something that we have to think about and look at intelligently. Just as looking at your food and your meals and what you eat is so important to your health, and understanding it and learning about it. I think cell phones, screen time, electronic devices have to be looked at in a similar manner, and that's what we're going to try to touch on tonight. There's some terms I'd like you to sort of understand, and you'll hear about them, but they help understand what we're dealing with. It's not just screen time and devices. Has anyone heard of something called attention engineering? Fancy word. Social media companies measure their success by how much time you are kind of stuck to their screen, to their product. They employ scientists, psychologists, they employ technology, neuropsychology, brain function analysis to achieve this success. And so we're up against people who understand how to get us to stay on our phones and on the screen. And this is a quote from another scientist that I really think is important, because many of us aren't sure what category to put social media and screen time and computers in. Is it a learning device? Is it okay? Is it good for our kids? Is it a way to connect? But I thought this statement really made it clear to me what we're dealing with to a certain degree. And this, again, is another scientist's quote, that at its core, social media is an entertainment technology attached to a marketing platform, extracting bits and pieces of information, personal information, and preferences about the user. Does that make sense? So I think with that perspective, and once I read that, again, a quote from another scientist, that really shifted how I looked at my kids and other kids looking at some of the social media, as well as myself, the Instagram, the Snapchat, Facebook, and so forth. And I'm just going to repeat that. At its core, social media is an entertainment technology. It's attached to a marketing platform and really there to extract as much information, bits and pieces of information about your preferences and about who you are. Another sort of interesting fact that has come about from advances in medicine, there's something called a functional MRI, fMRI. So many of you have heard of MRIs, many of you have had MRIs, but a functional MRI, relatively new, relatively sophisticated, looks at metabolic function of different parts of the brain. What part of the brains are active when something goes on and when something occurs. And that functional MRIs have shown that the MRIs of a young person's brain, after 2 hours of gaming, which is kind of intense, I don't game, but they're playing these games, their functional MRI pattern, those areas of the brain that light up, that are active, have a similar pattern and metabolic pattern as those of adult brains that are affected by drugs such as cocaine and alcohol. So it's exciting, similar parts of the brain, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we move through this. So some of the things we do know is that our dependence on smartphones, social media, search engines, etc., really has a number of different effects. It affects our psychological makeup, physiology of the brain is affected by social media and our exposure to it, and even the anatomy of our brains can be affected by exposure or overexposure, and I should probably emphasize that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, of our brains. And so it affects the structure and the function of our brains, our kids' brains, and our grandkids' brains. So it's doing something to our brains in ways that we're still trying to understand. And as you all know, screen time for everybody is increasing. One interesting study showed that before 2011, I think the iPad came out in 2010 roughly, and 2011, only 2% of kids under 2 were exposed to any screens, iPads, smartphones. And now, it's probably as high as 60 to 70% of kids under 2 use screens, phones, or maybe I should say their parents use screens and phones to babysit or to distract your young kids. So it's starting as young as 2, and of course as you get older we see our teenagers. I saw my teenagers using the phones and smart screens. It just has increased, and again we still don't know all the effects of that. I think as I was talking about the brain and structure function, there's a term I'd like you to know. There won't be a quiz on this afterwards, but neuroplasticity. So our brain is made up of a multitude of pathways, millions and billions of cells, all interconnected by pathways. And as we go through life, the brain is building those pathways, developing new pathways. If a part of the brain is injured, new pathways may develop around it and so forth. And this neuroplasticity goes on all through life, but it is very significant during the developmental years of the brain. And this neuroplasticity is really kind of the basis of learning. And the developing brain needs intellectual stimulation, it needs physical stimulation, it needs music, it needs math, it needs language, it needs social interaction. It needs all of those things to fully develop all of the different pathways. And these pathways respond to environmental stimuli and what you're doing in life. And so you can develop robust pathways by habits and patterns in life. And on the opposite side, God has made our brain such that it is so efficient that if you don't use pathways, the brain will automatically prune those pathways away. So it's important not just to develop pathways, but to avoid pathways being pruned, if you will, by lack of use. And you can imagine what hours and hours of screen time may do to some of those pathways. And as I mentioned, the strengthening these neuronal pathways are really the basis of learning. And again, it takes multidimensional stimuli to do that in the young developing brain and in our brains. On the opposite end of the perspective, as we get older, it is much more important to continue to develop robust pathways, work around pathways, work through things, use your brain. There's a sort of a neurological thought in brain development, neuronal development, that neurons that fire together wire together. So those pathways are developed by the interaction of the neurons and your environmental stimuli. You want complexity in your life at any age. And as I mentioned, the brain development occurs up into age 25 in a male, 23 to 25. In females, as all the females in the room know, happens at a much earlier age, 17 to 18. And that brain development, one of the last parts of the brain to develop are the frontal lobes. And the frontal lobes are very important in success in life, if you will. It is the air traffic controller of your brain. It's executive function, organization, understanding of consequences. It helps you understand social cues and subtleties in your environment. And we'll talk a little bit about it, but some studies, MRIs, have shown that one of the areas of the brain affected by overuse of screen time are the frontal lobes. And I think that, again, we don't have all the data and information to say how much, and I don't want to come across as saying, oh, these things are bad, throw them all away. I think it's important to understand there is an effect, and we have to make wise choices. But I think, as Pastor Phil has talked about food, and we had a great demonstration about food, you have to make choices there as well. If we had a demonstration tonight about eating donuts and making donuts and how much powdered sugar to put on it and how many we can eat, you know, there'd be consequences to that as well. And so it's really about making choices in all avenues of our life, in all aspects of our life. And I think we just need awareness that social media, screen time, computers, smartphones need to be part of those smart choices. So without delving too much into neurochemistry, I want to talk about some physiology a little bit. One of the ways the brain functions is we have neurotransmitters. It allows one cell to talk to another cell. And one of those neurotransmitters is dopamine. Some of you may have heard of that. It's affected in a number of different problems and issues. But dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is associated with sort of the reward center of the brain, maybe the pleasure center of the brain. It certainly has other effects, but that's one of the main functions I want to discuss tonight. It also is associated with addiction, and we see dopaminergic surges in the brain with use of cocaine and things along those lines. But also studies have shown that dopamine, the pleasure centers, reward centers, also are stimulated by social media. And that's not by accident. The constant flashing of lights, colors, pings, pictures, auditory stimulation that one finds in social media is there really in part to increase the dopamine, to increase the sort of reward for what you're doing. And those patterns that you see of friends and likes and all these other things, those patterns are also calculated and presented to you in a manner, to your kids and grandkids in a manner, that increases your tendency to want to use that device or stay on that screen or on that device. So it's very sophisticated. These companies employ these patterns, these rewards, these flashes of color to maximize your stimulation, maximize dopamine release. And they also employ psychological sort of techniques, if you will, such as classical techniques of intermittent reward. Intermittent reward is a way to, if you will, train a lab animal or to train humans to do things that instead of rewarding every time you do something, you get intermittent reward. You do it once, you get a reward. You do it twice, you get a reward. Third time you don't. Fourth time you do. This irregular pattern is also incorporated into some of the social media that we're on. Again, trying to get you to stay on those pages and having an effect on your brain, having an effect on the physiology of the brain and dopamine and so forth. There are studies with animals, and it's always hard to correlate animal studies with human studies, but there's a lot more depth to some of what I'm speaking about in terms of some of the studies that have been done on how it affects dopamine and dopamine receptors in the brain. I mentioned earlier the anatomy of the brain. Frontal lobes are discussed. There will be a quiz on that at the end. You'll have to tell me what frontal lobes do. But as I mentioned, there have been MRI studies in people who heavily use screens. And most of these studies come out of China. Most of them have been done on these young people who live for gaming and are gaming all the time. It's just around the clock. And these sensitive new MRI studies show that there is loss of mass, thinning of the cortex in certain areas of the brain, basal ganglia, frontal lobes, insula. So there are certain parts of the brains that are being affected anatomically and structurally by overuse of these screens. So again, it's not just a toy. So knowing that there can be some atrophy, shrinkage, thinning of certain parts of the brain, when you yell at your grandkids or your kids that put that screen away, it's making your brain rot, there is some science behind that statement. It does cause some change in that brain. I think another very important area, and I think most of us have heard about this, is how it affects our sleep. These devices emit a very intense blue light. They have to, so that we can see them in natural ambient light outside or in the sun in here. So this intense blue light affects our eyes directly. And this blue light affects melatonin. We've all heard that term. It's the time to sleep cue that our brain has, and this blue light stimulation can affect melatonin production. It's more complex than that, but I'll keep it sort of simple. So it can disrupt your sleep, your ability to sleep, your day-night cycle, your circadian rhythm can all be thrown off by using these bright lights, the smartphones late at night. And all of us who have observed our kids, grandkids, and maybe us, we're checking our emails, we're checking things before we go to bed. And one of the simple rules that have been put forth is to stay away from screen intense light for at least 2 hours before you go to bed or your child or grandchild goes to bed. There are also other devices you can employ, screen protectors that reportedly stop blue light. There's glasses that you can get as well. But I think the simple and best rule is to understand, it does affect your sleep and sleep pattern, and that staying away from it for 2 hours before going to sleep, I think is important. When you disrupt sleep, it's not just, I'm tired the next day. It does affect the ability to learn. It affects memory. It affects brain development in the young person with brain development going on. It can affect your overall health. And it can certainly influence weight gain and obesity. In fact, there's studies showing a direct correlation between sleep deprivation and obesity. So sleep is an important part of a healthy lifestyle, and screen time can interfere with that. So turn off the screen 2 hours before you go to bed, have your kids do the same thing, and that should have a positive effect. I think the other aspect of screen time, this indulgence that we do and kids do, is it affects our learning. So as adults, we need to be constant learners. We need to be learning every day. Our jobs, certainly as a neurosurgeon, what I did 25 years ago is obsolete, and I have to learn every day, as many of you do. So learning can be affected by this sort of overuse of some of these screen times. I won't go into theories of learning, but a classic one is Piaget's theory of cognitive development, sort of well-known study of brain development and learning. There are other models of learning that also show that it really takes a broad set of experiences, as I mentioned earlier, to stimulate and facilitate normal brain development. Social experiences, as I mentioned, academic experiences, physical learning, and exploring are all important parts of normal development. And I think if we or our kids are focused on a screen for that 9 hours a day, that's a problem. Not only is there a direct effect on the brain, but it's eliminating many of these other things, climbing a tree, playing tag, playing football, other things that are important. And another aspect of this sort of indulgence with screen is that young people who are growing up with these screens are losing the ability to sort of interpret our personal cues from each other. When we talk, when I communicate, when we talk to each other, 80 to 90% of how we communicate is our body language, our intonation, a wink, a roll of an eye. All of those things are so important. And there are studies indicating that kids brought up in their phones, in their screens with thousands of friends, at least online, are losing the ability for the subtleties of sarcasm and those sorts of things, humor and direct human communication. It's becoming a lost art. So in conclusion, one, I want to thank you for your attention, but in conclusion, the brain, we have to understand, is constantly changing. We're learning, we're developing pathways. Other pathways are being pruned and eliminated, and all of these things are sensitive to environmental influences. And the studies, some of them I quoted tonight, others I haven't gone into great depth with, shows that this social media and screen involvement that we have in our lives really does have a significant effect on our brains. We don't have all of the answers yet. So again, I don't want to stand up here and say, oh boy, these are negative. I think they're tremendous tools. I can look up medical problems. I have been in Haiti and been able to send pictures of patients to the country here, and vice versa. I've been in other countries where things can be sent to me by picture and they can be discussed. So these are amazing, wonderful, powerful tools. But I think we have to know that the structure and anatomy of the brain can be affected by them. The physiology, neurotransmitters can be affected by it. Sleep can be affected by it. And learning and development at every stage of your life can be affected by it. And I think as part of a healthy lifestyle, we should just be aware of these things, aware of the possible consequences, be cognizant of our own screen time, and perhaps like other healthy habits, we use these devices with moderation, awareness, and a little bit of caution. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Doc. And now we're going to give you an opportunity to ask him any questions that you want relative to this subject or the subject of the brain. So please raise your hand. Don't speak up without a microphone in it. We've got a couple of mics around here. So, okay, here's one coming up right here.
I had a lot of questions before you started, and one by one you were addressing them, like circadian rhythm. You mentioned, and also about the neurodevelopment, how it peaks in men after 25, and women in 17 and 18. My question about the blue screen is, it's very known that blue screen is incorporated in cell phone. I'm not sure if they are in flat screen TVs. So the rule about 2 hours before go to bed to avoid any blue screen, does that also include the big screen TV? Since it's always in a room environment and not outside, they might not incorporate that technology. But does it also apply to those screens?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. That's an excellent question. The blue light that is emitted from computer screens and cell phones, as you said, is well documented and has a direct influence physiologically on the retina of our eye and something called melanopsin, which affects melatonin, and that's well established. I think televisions, I've looked into, and I don't know if that emits the same blue light, but my colleagues who are sleep specialists have made the recommendation to me, as I've talked about this, not to have your TV in your bedroom, to make your bedroom the place where you sleep and have the TV outside the bedroom, and not to go to sleep with the TV on. And that recommendation that they've passed on to me as sleep specialists, I don't think had so much to do with the blue light, but it has to do with the stimulation. Because a couple of things happen from screens. One is blue light, but the other just stimulation. You're watching Saving Private Ryan 5 minutes before you go to bed. You're going to be hyped up and your heart's racing and all those sorts of things. So I think there's a couple of things going on with screens and television, but my recommendation would be to move that out of the bedroom and avoid watching that, as you get prepared to sleep, particularly if you have sleep problems or getting to sleep problems, yes.
All right, another question. Anyone else? Right here in the front row.
Well, when you were talking about teenagers and gaming and that kind of thing, my concern has been my grandson, who is virtually addicted to gaming, and the lack of physical activity that seems to go along with that. So that impacts the brain also?
It does.
That's my question.
It does. So very good question. Her question, for those of you who may not have heard it, was this lack of physical activity that comes with gaming and screen time, does it affect brain development? And it certainly does, directly and indirectly. But the studies of learning and development, Piaget, that I mentioned, shows that you need to have a complex environment, social, physical, exploring, academic, music, mathematics, to develop the brain and to learn. So I think that if you're focused just on screen, you're developing pathways, you're developing a highway between certain pathways, a freeway, but other pathways are not being developed. Yeah.
Another question. Okay, right here. We have a couple.
How about these new earbuds they're using that stick out of their ear with no wires?
Yeah. So that is a great question. And in fact, you're not the first person to ask me that. My family has asked me that. So I think the concern with any electronic device that is next to your head constantly, I think some of the best medical recommendations for phones, screen, electronic devices is to keep it away from you. Use it on speakerphone, use it remote, use it on your car speakerphone, et cetera. So I think there is still a concern about electromagnetic and radio frequency exposure with device too close to your head. There are actually MRI studies that I brought with me that show the pattern of electrical field, if you will, on a child's head when they have the phone next to them. It goes much deeper into their brain than it does on an adult head, because our heads are thicker, as our kids tell us regularly. So I think those devices, to get your answer, you're putting a electronic device into one of the only apertures in your brain, which gives a direct link. I don't know scientists that if they have come to a conclusion about that exposure, but I personally am a little hesitant to put electromagnetic fields, right into my brain. So I don't think the answer is in, but unfortunately, maybe like cigarettes or certain dietary habits, we may not know the answer to that till a generation from now.
Okay, there was another question here. Yes.
Yeah, a very simple one. After listening to you, can you hear me?
Yes.
After listening to you, it seems to me that there are many indicators, correct me if I'm mistaken, that could this become an epidemic in the future as we have had in the past, to the point that in the future our children or grandchildren will have to go to detox places to correct all this malfunctioning of the brains. Given that, and of course, the people in the business of social media are always appealing to the freedom of speech, which most of the world seems to adore that without limits. How hopeful are you that someday legislation will put an end or barrier or stopping or slow down to this future epidemic?
Yeah, that is a great question and a deep question, and I appreciate your thoughts on that. I think that what we're doing here tonight is our best defense against overuse in these problems. I think education and understanding of medical issues, and this we could consider a medical issue, I think your education, your understanding of it is going to be our best defense. Limiting what we do, mitigating the effects of it, and doing that with the next generation. Like everything else, you know, as parents, our God-given role is to guide our kids, guide that next generation in their walk with the Lord. And I think that it will be our responsibility to learn as you are tonight and pass that on to the next generation. So I think our best defense is going to be understanding and understanding the science behind it. But I think it's a very interesting question. Will government have to step in at some level to control monopolies and things like that of information? Because that's what we're dealing with. I know when I go to my Google News, it gives me the news I want to see now. Because when I look at a news story, it knows the next time I go, and it sends me just those stories. It's very interesting. And so I think you're very wise that we have to be cautious and proceed into the future with our eyes open.
We have time for another question. Yes.
I have a question about necks and thumbs. Thank you for being here, by the way. I trained to be a yoga teacher, and I see even my own kids like constantly bending down, trying to use their thumbs to text about the 1,000th text in the day. Very concerned about overuse of thumbs.
Yeah.
And very concerned, extremely concerned about how their necks are constantly down even when they're walking to school or from school or anything like that. And have they any reports about that? Like,
sure, absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks.
So that's a great question. Screen time comes with this posture for most of us, right? We're like this all day long. And medically, they've defined that problem that with the neck as text neck. Everything has to have a clever name. So text neck is now a medical term in our medical vocabulary, that young people, old people, are developing neck pain and neck problems because of exactly what you're speaking about, this posture of looking down constantly. And so, again, I think awareness of that, as you brought to our attention here tonight, understanding that, and understanding what good posture is important. And just a brief note on that, we want to carry ourselves all day in a balanced position, and not just our neck. Our neck is the roof, but our foundation is the low back. And we want a line drawn through our ear, our shoulders, what we call our iliac crest, and our heel. And if we're out of balance, that's just going to put strain on our back, strain on our neck. Our neck, you can find that neutral position by just sort of taking this and putting it in your sternal notch. That's the neutral position. When you're out of that neutral position for too long, at a movie theater, reading, texting, you're going to have neck discomfort. And if you do that daily for years, you then develop bad posture. So I think it's important to be aware of that and make your kids aware of that.
All right, we have time for one more question. I see a hand right here. And then I'm sure that if you have any additional questions that you would like to speak with Dr. Armstrong about, perhaps he'll stick around for another couple of minutes. But we do want to be conscientious of your time. And when we're done with this next question, Doctor, we've got the trailer queued up for the Connect movie that you were involved in, and we want to show that to you. So go ahead, ma'am.
Yes, thank you so much. You've given us so much knowledge tonight. What about the flashlights when we're using the cameras on our phones? How much effect does that have on our eyes and the brain area?
Yeah, I think that light in general can cause stimulation. Blue light on a higher scale than regular light. And I think intermittent exposure to lights while you're driving in traffic or a camera, I think, are probably relatively harmless, as long as it's intermittent. I think it's the constant, steady, intense blue light that is stimulating the brain in ways that